Welcome back to our fourth and final unit in our section in our photosynthesis unit, and now we're going to look at trophic levels and specifically the autotrophs. So now we've gone through how we can get energy from light from photons, how the chlorophyll will grab those photons and use it to excite electrons and produce ATP and NADPH, how the Calvin cycle through photosynthesis in the light independent reaction takes the ATP and NADPH and creates sugars. Now, how do animals, us as humans being one of those, actually use use that sugar? So we're going to look at a little bit of ecosystems here and start with trophic levels. So trophic level is basically a step on an energy ladder that energy is passed through. So if we look here, ultimately, all energy comes from the sun, so we've got our solar energy. And autotrophs are the ones that are able to convert solar energy to chemical energy, glucose. So these are called primary producers. And anything that can carry out photosynthesis is a primary producer. Now, unfortunately, as animals, we're not primary producers, so we can't use the sun directly. So we have got to get our energy from these autotrophs. So the autotrophs are anything that can make their own energy. And unfortunately, we need to eat other things in order to get our energy, so we are called heterotrophs. The energy is coming from other places. So we're known as consumers. We're also going to talk about decomposers that break down. They get their energy from dead and decaying material. So these are the two major trophic levels that we have. We've got the autotrophs that are able to make their own energy, and we've got the heterotrophs that need to consume other organisms and get their energy. And there's this cycling of nutrients through the ecosystem because of the interplay of these two. So here's a kind of busy slide, but hopefully we can get something out of this. So as I said before, ultimately all energy comes from the sun and moves through the trophic levels of the ecosystem. So if we start down here at the bottom, I know it's not written down here, but ultimately this would be the sun. And primary producers, I'm going to look at the left-hand one, a terrestrial ecosystem. The primary producers are those organisms, plants, that can use the energy from the sun directly to create sugar, glucose. Now, anything that eats a plant is known as an herbivore, and they are the primary producers. Okay, the first trophic level that needs to consume other animals. In this case, we've got a grasshopper. Now, if a mouse were to eat that grasshopper, they're known as carnivores because they're eating meat. They are then the secondary consumers. They're the second trophic level of consumers. A snake that then eats that mouse is called a tertiary consumer. And then if a hawk were to eat that snake, they would be a quaternary, the fourth level of consumers. So here is a food chain that goes from the sun through the primary producers. Oops. Let's see if we can get rid of that. Through the primary producers, through the different levels of consumers to our top order consumer. Now on the right, what is shown, there's a marine food chain. So we have phytoplankton being eaten by zooplankton, being eaten by small fish, eaten by larger fish, and finally by orca, a killer whale. But all of this shows the energy going through that ecosystem. And each level, each rung on the ladders, if you will, here, is a trophic level. So we can go through and look at that. Now, as we go through, there's the rule of 10%. And what this says, on average, only 10% of energy is passed to the next trophic level. That means that 90% is lost as heat and waste. So only 10% of the body mass of this grasshopper will be available to the mouse that eats it. And therefore only 10% to the snake and only 10% to the hawk going up. So you can see very quickly the amount of energy in the ecosystem goes down because of the inefficiencies. So if you remember about our laws of thermodynamics, we're losing energy as heat as we go up through here. So here's a case with the numbers. So down at the very bottom, we've got the producers, trees and grass. they get their energy directly from the sun. Okay? And they have 10,000 kilocalories. And because of heat loss, the rabbit that eats them, they only end up with 1,000 calories, 10%. And they're the primary consumers. And the snake that eats the rabbit, they lose another 90%. So what's passed on here is only 100 kilocalories. And finally, when we get to the top trophic level here, the eagle, only 10% is passed on. So by the time we get up to the eagle, we've got only 10 kilocalories left. Now, let's say that there is one trophic level above this. How many kilocalories would it be available to those organisms? And if you do your math, 10% of 10 is going to be 1 kilocalorie. So that's why there's a lot fewer eagles than there are snakes. And there's fewer snakes than there are rabbits, and there's fewer rabbits than there is grass and trees, because there's just not enough energy to support the numbers of organisms at each of those different trophic levels. So let's, as we go along, let's try to remember the rule of 10%. So the next thing we're going to look at is something that I mentioned but we've kind of ignored so far, the decomposers. So anytime we look at a food chain or food web, you've got to have decomposers. So they consume and eat dead plants and animals and decompose them. So it reduces them to simpler forms of matter. And the big ones that we want to look at would be fungi and bacteria. So in any food web or chain, we've looked at chains, but eventually we'll get to food webs. Anytime we look at those, we can basically insert decomposers in there anywhere we want. So if we look at a pyramid, an ecological pyramid here, where we've got the producers. Slide this over, there we go, just a little bit. We've got the producers at the bottom, and then we've got the herbivores, the primary consumers, and then the secondary, and then finally the tertiary. And you can see as we get up to the top of the pyramid, by the time we get up here to the tertiary consumers, there's not a lot of energy left, so there's not a lot of numbers of those. Well, where do the decomposers fit in? The decomposers could fit in anywhere on this pyramid. Some of them are going to decompose rotting grass and plants from the primary producer level. Some of them will break down the dead bodies of primary consumers. Some of them can break down secondary consumers and all the way up to tertiary consumers. So the decomposers could really fit in anywhere on this pyramid. So where does this fit into the grand scheme of photosynthesis, and why have we included it here? Well, the autotrophs, the producers, are the ones that have to harness the solar energy from the sun and convert it into chemical energy for all of the other trophic levels. If it wasn't for the very base of this pyramid, then none of the other levels, none of the other kind of steps on the ladder would be able to survive. So this really ties the idea of photosynthesis into energy transfers in an ecosystem and why life is actually possible on Earth. So this wraps up our photosynthesis unit, and moving ahead we'll be looking at respiration. So how do we take the sugar and break it down? But again, thank you for the time for photosynthesis, and we will see you soon.